Lyra had dreamed of this moment for 3 years, but now that she stood in the grand trading hall of Station Zenith Prime, she felt nothing but cold fear spreading through her chest. The station was the largest commercial hub in this sector of the galaxy, and beings from 1,000 different worlds came here to buy and sell and make deals that would shape the futures of entire planets. She was an elf from the forest moon of Eldara, and her people were dying slowly because their world could no longer support them after the Great Blight had destroyed most of their crops. The elders had pooled together everything they had and given it to Lyra, because she was young and smart and brave enough to venture into the wider galaxy to find help. On her shoulders sat 2 small dragons no bigger than house cats, and their scales shimmered green and gold in the station's bright lights. The one on her left was named Ember, and she was fierce and protective, while the one on her right was Ash, who was quieter, but watched everything with intelligent eyes. These dragons were sacred to her people, and having them with her was supposed to bring good fortune. But right now, Lyra wondered if the old beliefs meant anything at all in this cold metal world. She clutched the datapad that contained all her trading credentials and the documentation, proving she had the right to represent her colony in galactic commerce. The hall was massive, with ceilings that stretched up so high they seemed to touch the artificial sky, and everywhere she looked there were aliens of shapes and sizes she had never imagined possible. There were beings made of crystalline structures that chimed when they moved, and others that floated in bubbles of strange, colored gas, and still others that looked like walking plants or living metals. Lyra felt very small and very alone, despite the crowds pressing in around her. She had spent weeks learning the basic protocols and studying the laws that governed trade between species, but knowing the rules and actually being here were 2 completely different things. Her appointment with the trade magistrate was in 10 minutes. And her hands were shaking as she made her way through the crowd toward the registration desk. A tall insectoid creature bumped into her without apologizing, and Ember hissed. But Lyra quickly stroked the dragon's head to calm her. Making enemies here would be the worst possible start to this journey, and she needed to be diplomatic, no matter how rude others were. The registration desk was staffed by a being that looked like a floating brain encased in a transparent sphere, and it spoke through a mechanical translator that hung in the air beside it. Name and purpose, it said in a flat, emotionless voice. Lyra of Eldara, she said, and tried to keep her voice steady. Here to register for a Class 3 trading license. The floating brain extended a mechanical tendril, and she placed her datapad into the scanner that it offered. There was a long silence as the machine processed her information. And during that silence, Lyra noticed that several other aliens had stopped what they were doing to stare at her. She heard whispers in languages she did not understand, and saw pointing, and what might have been laughter from creatures whose faces she could not read. A group of well-dressed aliens stood near a pillar, and they were clearly wealthy from the way they carried themselves in the expensive clothes and jewelry they wore. One of them was a Vaxian with 4 arms and skin that rippled with colors, and he was looking at Lyra with an expression that she recognized even across species lines. It was contempt, and it made her stomach twist with anxiety. The scanner beeped, and the floating brain's mechanical voice said, "There is a problem with your credentials." What kind of problem? Lyra asked and felt panic rising in her throat. They have been flagged as potentially fraudulent. The brain said you will need to speak with the chief magistrate immediately. But they are not fraudulent, Lyra protested. I obtained them through proper channels and everything was verified by. Your protest has been noted. The brain interrupted. Now please proceed to holding area 7 and wait for the magistrate. 2 large guards appeared from nowhere, and they were Kryn warriors with thick armored exoskeletons and multiple legs that clicked against the metal floor. One of them grabbed Lyra's arm with a pincer that was surprisingly gentle, despite looking deadly. You will come with us, the guard said. Ember and Ash both began to hiss, and smoke curled from their nostrils, but they were too small to be any real threat to these massive creatures. The guards began walking, and Lyra had no choice but to stumble along between them as they moved through the crowd. People turned to watch, and the whispers grew louder, and she caught fragments of conversation in the common trade language. Look at that primitive creature. One voice said, Did she really think she could trade here? Another laughed. Her kind should stay on their backward moons, a third added with obvious scorn. Lyra felt her face burning with shame. But she kept her head up, because the elders had taught her that dignity mattered even When the world seemed determined to strip it away, the guards led her through a side corridor and then into a large chamber where the chief magistrate waited. He was enormous, even by the standards of this place where giants seemed common, and his species was one Lyra recognized from her studies. Zarthek was a high-ranking Kryn, and his compound eyes reflected the light in a way that made them seem to glow with their own inner fire. His mandibles clicked together as he looked at her, and the sound echoed in the chamber like bones breaking. "So this is the elf who thinks she can conduct galactic trade," he said, and his voice was deep and buzzing. "I have every right to be here," Lyra said, and forced herself to meet his gaze. "I have followed all the proper procedures, and my credentials are legitimate." Zarthek held up a datapad and said, "These credentials you speak of have been examined and found to be falsified." "That is not possible," Lyra said, and felt the ground dropping away beneath her feet. The magistrate's mandibles clicked again in what might have been laughter, and he said, "You will be detained pending a full investigation, and if you are found guilty of fraud, you will be banned from this station and all affiliated trading posts, but my people are counting on me," Lyra whispered, and hated how weak her voice sounded. "We need trade agreements or we will not survive." "That is not my concern," Zarthek said coldly now. "Take her to the detention wing." The guards grabbed her arms, again, and this time their pincers tightened painfully. Ember shrieked and shot a small jet of flame that singed one guard's antenna, but it only made him grip harder. As they dragged her back through the main hall, Lyra saw that a crowd had gathered, and they were all watching her humiliation with expressions ranging from amusement to disgust. The Vaxian she had noticed earlier stepped forward and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Look at this pathetic creature thinking she belongs among civilized beings." Others laughed and someone threw something that bounced off her shoulder. The dragons hissed and tried to protect her. But what could two small creatures do against a mob? Lyra felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes, and she bit her lip hard enough to taste blood because she would not cry in front of these people. She would not give them that satisfaction even as her world fell apart around her and all hope seemed lost. The guards pulled her forward, and the laughter followed them down the corridor like a wave of poison. The detention wing corridor stretched ahead like a tunnel leading to the end of everything Lyra had hoped for, and the metal walls seemed to close in around her with each step. The guards dragged her past doorways that hissed open to reveal cells, where other beings sat in various states of despair, and she wondered if she would soon be locked away in one of those small rooms. Ember and Ash had stopped hissing, and now they just pressed against her neck, seeking comfort as much as giving it behind them. The crowd's laughter still echoed through the halls, and Lyra could hear individual voices calling out insults and jokes at her expense. The Vaxian who had mocked her loudest was telling everyone who would listen about how primitive species always tried to cheat their way into civilized society. Each word felt like a hammer blow against her heart because she had done everything right and followed every rule, and still, she was being treated like a criminal. The guards stopped at a checkpoint, where another official sat behind a desk, and this one was a species Lyra did not recognize, with tentacles instead of arms and eyes that covered most of its round body. Processing. Another fraud case, the guard on her left said. The official's tentacles moved across a keyboard, and it said, "Cell Block 7 has space weight," Lyra said, and found her voice somehow pleased. "I have done nothing wrong, and someone has made a mistake with my credentials." The official did not even look up at her and said, "Everyone says that, but my people need me." She continued and felt desperation making her words tumble out faster. "I am their only hope for survival, and if I do not establish trade agreements, they will die." Still not looking up, the official said, "Not my problem." The guard on her right started pulling her forward again, and Lyra felt something break inside her chest. She had been so sure that justice would prevail and that truth would matter in a civilization as advanced as this one. Her father had told her before. She left that the galaxy was big and beautiful and full of wonders, but he had also warned her that not everyone would treat her kindly. She wished now that she had listened more carefully to his warnings. They turned a corner, and suddenly Lyra heard a voice that cut through all the noise and chaos like a beam of pure light. "Let her go," the voice said. Everyone stopped and turned to look, and Lyra managed to lift her head enough to see who had spoken. A human woman was walking toward them through the crowd, and she moved with a confidence that seemed to part the sea of aliens around her. She was not particularly tall compared to most of the species present, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style, but there was something about the way she carried herself that demanded attention. Her clothes were plain gray coveralls marked with the symbol of an independent contractor, and she wore sturdy boots that had clearly seen a lot of use. The Kryn guards shifted their grips on Lyra, but did not release her. "Who are you to interfere with official business?" one guard demanded. The human woman pulled out an identification badge and held it up and said, "My name is Maya Torres, and I am a licensed credential authenticator on this station." Lyra felt a tiny spark of hope flicker in her chest, but she was afraid to let it grow. The guard clicked his mandibles skeptically and said, "This matter has already been decided by the magistrate." "Has it?" Maya said, and her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it because I just reviewed this case and I found some very interesting discrepancies. She walked closer, and now Lyra could see her face clearly, and the human's brown eyes were sharp and intelligent. The crowd that had been laughing moments before was now quiet and watching this new drama unfold with interest. "What discrepancies?" the guard asked and sounded uncertain for the first time. Maya pulled out her datapad and said the credentials that were flagged as fraudulent were actually verified through proper channels 2 hours ago by the Central Authentication Database. Then why were they flagged? Another voice called out, and Lyra recognized it as belonging to the Vaxian noble. "That is an excellent question," Maya said and turned to face the crowd because according to the access logs, someone from the magistrate's office entered the database at 3 in the morning and manually altered the verification codes. A murmur ran through the gathered aliens and several of them exchanged glances. The guard on Lyra's left said, "That is a serious accusation to make against Chief Magistrate Zarthek." "I am not making accusations," Maya replied. "I am stating facts that are backed up by digital records that I can produce right now for anyone who wants to see them." She held up her datapad and said, "I have screenshots and timestamps and digital signatures, and unless someone can explain why the magistrate's office was altering credential verification codes in the middle of the night, I suggest you release this person immediately." The guards looked at each other and Lyra could feel their grip loosening slightly. From somewhere in the crowd, Zarthek's buzzing voice called out, and he pushed his way forward with his massive body, forcing smaller beings aside. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" he demanded. Maya did not back down even though the magistrate towered over her and said, "I am preventing a miscarriage of justice." "There is no miscarriage," Zarthek said. This elf presented fraudulent credentials, and these credentials are not fraudulent. Maya interrupted, "And I can prove it." The magistrate's compound eyes seemed to glow brighter, and he said, "You dare challenge my authority?" "I challenge any authority that is being used to harm innocent people," Maya said, and her voice rang out clear and strong. The crowd was completely silent now, and even the background hum of the station systems seemed to fade away. Zarthek's mandibles clicked rapidly, and Lyra had learned enough about Kryn body language to know this meant he was stressed or angry. "Show me this proof," he finally said. Maya stepped forward and connected her datapad to a public display screen, and suddenly everyone could see the records she had mentioned. There were timestamps showing when Lyra's credentials had been properly verified, and then another timestamp hours later, showing unauthorized access from the magistrate's terminal. There were before and after images of the credential files showing how the verification codes had been changed, and there at the bottom was a digital signature that traced back to an account registered to someone in Zarthek's office. The silence stretched on, and Lyra held her breath, waiting to see what would happen. Finally, the Vaxian noble who had been so eager to mock her earlier said in a quieter voice, "Perhaps there has been some mistake." Other voices joined in, suddenly agreeing that maybe the situation deserved another look. Maya turned to face the crowd and said, "I have a question for all of you." Everyone waited, and she continued, "Why did not one of you ask if this was right?" She gestured to Lyra and said, "You saw someone being dragged away, and you laughed and you mocked and you threw things, and not one of you stopped to wonder if maybe she was telling the truth." The wealthy aliens who had been so entertained minutes before now looked uncomfortable, and several of them found reasons to study their own datapads or the walls or anything. except the human woman's accusing gaze. Maya said, "Where I come from, we have a saying, and it goes like this. The true measure of a civilization is not how it treats its most powerful members, but how it treats those who have no power at all." She let that sink in and then added, "And based on what I just witnessed here, your civilization has a long way to go." Zarthek made a sound like grinding metal and said, "Very well. There appears to have been an administrative error, and the charges are dismissed. Release her," he ordered the guards. The pincers opened and Lyra stumbled forward and would have fallen, except Maya caught her with surprisingly strong hands. The human steadied her and said softly, "Are you okay?" Lyra could not speak because her throat was tight, with emotions she could not name. Lyra managed a shaky nod, but her legs felt like they might give out at any moment, and Maya kept one hand on her elbow to steady her. The dragons on her shoulders chirped softly, and Ember reached out to touch Maya's hand with one tiny claw in what seemed like gratitude. The crowd began to disperse quickly, and the nobles who had been so entertained by Lyra's humiliation now could not leave fast enough. The Vaxian noble brushed past without making eye contact, and several others followed his lead as if fleeing from something shameful. Zarthek stood rigid for a moment longer, and his compound eyes fixed on Maya with an expression that might have been anger or possibly respect. Or maybe both. "You have made a powerful enemy today, human," he said in a low voice. Maya met his gaze without flinching and said, "I have made many enemies by doing what is right, and I will sleep just fine tonight." The magistrate turned and stalked away with his guards following behind, and soon the corridor was nearly empty except for a few curious onlookers who lingered to see what would happen next. Maya guided Lyra to a nearby bench and said, "Here, sit down." Before you fall down, Lyra sank onto the bench and realized she was shaking all over, and ash nuzzled against her cheek, making worried sounds. Maya sat beside her and pulled out a small flask from one of her coverall pockets and said, "Drink this. It will help." Lyra took the flask with trembling hands and sipped carefully, and the liquid inside was sweet and warm and seemed to spread calm through her body. "What is this?" she asked. "Just tea," Maya said with a small smile. "I always carry some with me because you never know when you will need it." They sat in silence for a moment, and Lyra tried to process everything that had just happened. Finally, she found her voice and said, "Why did you help me?" Maya looked at her with those sharp brown eyes and said, "Because it was the right thing to do." "But you do not know me," Lyra said, "and you risked making an enemy of the chief magistrate for a complete stranger." The human shrugged and said, "I know enough, and I know what it looks like when someone is being treated unfairly." She paused and then added, "Besides, I ran your credentials through my own systems yesterday, when I saw them flagged, and I knew something was wrong because the verification was clean." "You knew yesterday," Lyra said in surprise. Maya nodded and said, "I started investigating right away, but I needed to gather enough evidence to make sure my case was solid, because Zarthek is not someone you accuse lightly. So you prepared all of this." Lyra gestured vaguely at where the display screen had been. "I did my homework," Maya said, "and then I waited to see what would happen, and when I saw them dragging you away, I knew it was time to act." Lyra felt tears starting to well up again, but this time they were not from fear or shame, and said, "I do not know how to thank you." Maya patted her shoulder gently and said, "You can thank me by succeeding at whatever you came here to do." Lyra took a deep breath and said, "I came to establish trade agreements for my colony, and my people are dying, because our world can no longer support us after a blight destroyed our crops." "That is a good reason to be here," Maya said. "What do your people have to trade?" Lyra pulled out her datapad with hands that were steadier now and said, "We have rare herbs that can be used in medicine, and we have skilled artisans who make beautiful things, and we have knowledge of sustainable farming techniques that work on low-resource moons." Maya looked at the information, and her expression grew thoughtful and said, "This is actually quite valuable." Lyra felt hope beginning to grow in her chest again and said, "Do you really think so?" "I know," so Maya said and looked up at her. "But you are going to need help navigating this place, because clearly there are people who do not want you to succeed." "Why would they not want me to succeed?" Lyra asked. Maya sighed and said, "Sometimes it is about money, and sometimes it is about power, and sometimes people are just cruel because they can be." She stood up and offered her hand to Lyra and said, "Come on. Let me show you around and introduce you to some people who are not complete jerks." Lyra took her hand and stood, and Maya was surprisingly strong for someone so much smaller than the average alien on this station. They walked together through the corridors, and Maya pointed out different sections and explained how things worked. She showed Lyra where the honest merchants gathered and where to avoid because certain areas were controlled by criminal syndicates. She explained which officials could be trusted and which ones were likely taking bribes. She taught Lyra the unwritten rules that no guidebook ever mentioned. As they walked, Ember and Ash seemed to relax, and the dragons even spread their small wings occasionally, as if testing the air. Other aliens they passed gave them curious looks, and some seemed surprised to see a human. Walking with an elf, Maya took Lyra to a small cafe that served food from dozens of different worlds, and they sat at a corner table where they could talk privately, over cups of a bitter drink that Maya called coffee. The human explained more about the station's politics. "There are 3 main trading consortiums that control most of the commerce here," Maya said, "and they do not like competition." "Is that why someone tried to frame me?" Lyra asked. "Probably," Maya said, though, proving it would be difficult. "And Zarthek was likely paid to look the other way or maybe even to actively help them. But you stopped them," Lyra said. "This time," Maya said, "I stopped them this time. But they will probably try again. So you need to be careful." Lyra felt the fear returning and said, "Maybe I should just go home." Maya reached across the table and said, "Hey, look at me." Lyra met her eyes, and Maya said, "If you go home now, they win, and your people lose their only chance." "I know," Lyra whispered, "but I am scared." "Being scared is okay," Maya said. "Being scared and doing it anyway is what makes you brave." The human leaned back and said, "Besides, you are not alone anymore, and I am going to help you." "Why would you do that?" Lyra asked. "I cannot pay you." Maya smiled and said, "Who said anything about payment?" But Lyra began. The human held up a hand and said, "Let me tell you something about humans, and we believe that when you see someone who needs help, you help them, not because you expect something in return, but because it is the right thing to do." She paused and then added, "Plus, I really do not like bullies, and those consortium jerks have been pushing around small traders for too long." Lyra felt something warm spreading through her chest, and it was not just the coffee. No one had ever stood up for her like this, and certainly no one had ever put themselves at risk for her sake. Maya pulled out her datapad again and said, "Okay, let us make a plan. And first we need to get your credentials officially reinstated, and then we need to find you some legitimate buyers who are not afraid of the consortiums." Over the next hour they worked together, mapping out a strategy, and Maya knew so much about the station and its politics that Lyra felt her hope growing stronger with each passing minute. Finally, Maya said, "I think we have a good start, and tomorrow I will take you to meet a friend of mine who runs an independent trading network." Lyra looked at this human woman who had appeared out of nowhere to save her and said, "I will never forget what you did for me today." Maya stood and said, "Just promise me that someday when you see someone who needs help, you will do the same for them." Lyra stood as well and said, "I promise." They walked back through the station together, and this time, when other aliens looked at them, Lyra held her head high. She had found an ally in the most unexpected place, and maybe, just maybe, her mission would succeed after all. The next morning, Lyra woke in the small room she had rented at the station's budget quarters, and for a moment she thought yesterday had been a dream. Then Ember and Ash stirred on the pillow beside her, and she remembered everything, and a smile crossed her face for the first time since arriving at this place. Maya had given her a communication device before they parted, and told her to meet at the Central Plaza at 1000 hours. Lyra dressed carefully in her best clothes, which were traditional elf garments made from plant fibers that shimmered with natural colors. The dragons perched on her shoulders as always, and they seemed more alert and curious than they had been the day before. She made her way through the station's corridors and noticed that some of the aliens she passed looked at her differently now. Word must have spread about what happened with the magistrate, and a few beings even nodded respectfully as she walked by. The Central Plaza was a massive open space under a transparent dome that showed the stars beyond, and in the center was a fountain that shot streams of liquid light into the air. Maya was waiting near the fountain, and beside her stood another human, and this one was a man with gray hair and kind "Eyes Lyra," Maya called when she spotted her. "Come meet someone." Lyra approached and the dragons chirped a greeting. "This is Carlos Rivera," Maya said, gesturing to the man, "and he runs one of the most successful independent trading networks in this sector." Carlos extended his hand in the human greeting style, and Lyra shook it carefully. "Maya has told me about your situation," he said, and his voice was warm. "And I think I can help you." "Really?" Lyra said, and felt hope flutter in her chest. Carlos nodded and said, "I have been looking for new suppliers of medicinal herbs, and your colony's products sound exactly like what my clients need." He pulled out a data pad and continued, "But before we talk business, I want you to know something important." Lyra waited and he said, "The consortiums that control most trade here do not like it when independents like me make deals with newcomers because it threatens their monopoly." "I understand," Lyra said. "Maya explained some of this to me." "Good," Carlos said, "because there might be more attempts to sabotage you and you need to be prepared." Maya added, "We have been doing some digging, and it looks like the Vaxian noble who mocked you yesterday is actually part owner of one of the major consortiums." Lyra remembered the four-armed being with the colorful skin and said, "Why would someone so wealthy care about my small trading operation?" "Because your small operation could grow," Maya said, "and if other colonies see that you succeeded, they might try the same thing, and suddenly the consortiums face real competition," Carlos said. "But that is exactly why we need to help you succeed, because someone has to stand up to them." Over the next hour, they discussed terms and prices and logistics, and Lyra was amazed at how fair Carlos was being. He offered prices that were much better than she had hoped for, and he even suggested ways she could improve her profit margins. When they finished, Carlos said, "I will send the contracts to your datapad, and once you sign them, I will place an initial order that should keep your colony supplied for 6 months." Lyra felt tears threatening again and said, "This is more than I ever expected." Carlos smiled and said, "Maya told me your people are depending on you, and I have a soft spot for underdogs." They shook hands again, and Carlos departed, leaving Maya and Lyra alone by the fountain. "Thank you," Lyra said for the 100th time. Maya laughed and said, "You need to stop thanking me and start believing in yourself." "But without you," Lyra began. "Without me, you would have found another way," Maya interrupted, "because I saw how you handled yourself yesterday, and you did not break even when everything seemed lost." Lyra considered this and said, "I wanted to break. Wanting to and actually doing it are two different things," Maya said. They walked through the plaza, and Maya pointed out various shops and services that Lyra might need, as they passed a large viewing window that looked out into space. Lyra stopped and said, "Can I ask you something of?" "Of course," Maya said. "Why are humans so different from the other species I have met here?" Lyra asked. "Everyone else seems to only care about profit and power, but you and Carlos helped me without asking for anything." Maya was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I cannot speak for all humans because we are not perfect and we have our own problems." She paused and continued, "But I think many humans believe that we are all connected in some way, and that helping others is the same as helping ourselves." Lyra looked out at the stars and said, "My people have a similar belief, but I did not expect to find it among aliens." "We are not so alien," Maya said with a smile. "We all want the same basic things, and safety and happiness, and a chance to build something good." Over the next few days, Maya continued to help Lyra navigate the complex world of galactic trade. She introduced her to more honest merchants and taught her how to spot scams and showed her the best places to eat and rest. The dragons seemed to thrive under Maya's attention, and they often chirped and performed small tricks to make her laugh. One afternoon, as they sat in a small garden area that simulated natural sunlight, Maya said, "I have something to tell you." Lyra looked up from the contract she was reviewing and said, "What is it?" "I have to leave the station in a few days," Maya said. "I have other clients who need my services on different worlds." Lyra felt her stomach drop and said, "Oh." Maya must have seen the fear on her face because she quickly added, "But you are going to be fine, and you have Carlos and his network, and you have made other friends here." "I do not feel ready," Lyra admitted. "You are more ready than you think," Maya said. "And besides, I am just a calm call away if you need advice." They sat in silence for a while, and finally Lyra said, "I wish I could do something for you in return." Maya smiled and said, "Then do this and succeed at what you came here to do, and show everyone that small colonies can make it in this big galaxy. I will. Try, Lyra promised. Do not just try. Maya said do it. The next day, Lyra received her first official payment from Carlos, and the amount was enough to send immediate relief supplies to her colony. She spent hours at the communication center sending messages home and explaining what had happened and assuring the elders that everything would be okay. Their responses were filled with joy and gratitude, and several of them specifically asked her to thank the human who had helped her. 2 days later, Lyra stood at the docking bay watching Maya prepare to board a transport ship. The human checked her bags one last time and then turned to face Lyra. Remember what I told you, Maya said. Stay alert and trust your instincts and do not let anyone push you. Around, Lyra nodded and said, I will remember everything. Maya reached out and gently touched Ember's head, and then Ash's, and said, Take care of her. You too. The dragons chirped and nuzzled against her hand. Then Maya pulled Lyra into a brief hug and said, You are going to do great things. When they separated, Lyra said, I hope I see you again someday. You will, Maya said. This galaxy is big, but it has a way of bringing people back together. She picked up her bags and walked toward the boarding ramp, and at the entrance she turned and waved. Lyra waved back and watched until Maya disappeared inside the ship. As the transport pulled away from the station, Lyra felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Maya had given her something more valuable than trade agreements or protection. She had given her the confidence to believe that she could succeed. Lyra turned and walked back into the station with her head held high, and the dragons on her shoulders seemed to sense her new resolve. There was work to do and a colony to save, and she was ready.